Great.
Can you hear me?
Working. So it's really great to have you. So we're going to speak about Swamp Thing, the something you did with the DC Comics. Can you tell us how, just in a general way, what do you like about the Swamp Thing character? Because it's one of our favorites. So
I think for me, it's very, you don't, when you're drawing it, you don't have to, there's no mistakes. You know, you can just follow wherever the brush is taking you. And it's so organic in its feeling that you just go with the flow, you know. And I'd always wanted to work on Swamp Thing as a character anyway. And to work with Ram was a plus as well.
Yeah, for me, my formative reading of Swamp Thing was the Alan Moore run. And it was such a shock to the system in terms of someone who had not read most of Alan Moore's work before then. And just something incredibly romantic about this shambling monster creature trying to understand and look for its humanity and not finding in it and finding something bigger inside of itself instead. I think to me that was the core of the character, and when it came to working on this book, that was what I took in terms of what Swamp Thing needed to be.
And it struck you as a personal thing, you know, this big shambolic monster.
Yes. I mean, as you know very well from seeing me at 7 a.m. in the morning. But yeah, no, I felt like you could tell a million stories with that framework. And so I think one of the early choices that allowed me to make was to say, hey, we're going to tell the story of an Indian character and not necessarily Alec Holland. And I remember I have a habit of sending very dramatic emails. So I remember once one of my editors had asked me, like, okay, why are we changing from Alec Holland again? Why are we going to an Indian character? And I said, because Alan Moore buried Alec Holland's bones in one of the issues. Haven't you read it? And so, yeah, it's just, I think it's a great vessel for telling really meaningful stories.
And I think that was one of the things when they first asked me to do it, that it was a different character. Because Ram was saying, Alec Holland's story has been told, and it's been told really well. And it's been told multiple times. So it was time to move on from that and introduce a new character.
You were just explaining to me how you came to work together at the time when Jeff Lemire was supposed to pilot the whole Swamp Thing series.
Yeah, I think Mike tells this story the best because Mike actually knows what happened.
I was in Baltimore, and it was the first time I met Jeff, and we got on really well together, and we're chatting about different things. And all the way on the flight back home, I was thinking, what could I work with Jeff on? And my first thought was we could do a fantastic Dead Man. And Jeff was like, it's a hard sell. But do you want to do, I'm writing a Swamp Thing book. Do you want to do that? And I was like, yeah, of course. Then that kind of all fell apart. But Jeff said, okay, we're doing this line of comics. Ram is writing the Swamp Thing. I'd like you to do that one. And so I read These Savage Shores, and I was like, okay, I've got to work with this guy, you know. And so that's really how it came about. And then after that, that all fell apart. I mean, the Swamp thing was still there, but the horror line and everything. And Jeff came back to me and he's like, oh, I'm back to do that Swamp Thing story. Do you want to draw it now?
It was Green Hell?
Yeah. Do you want to draw it now? I'm like, I'm so invested in this one now. I actually was trying to convince myself that I could do both of them. But that's the story of my life. Like, I want to do everything.
Yeah, it was the same, at least in terms of that sort of reaction to seeing someone's work. My Swamp Thing in my head had always been, Bernie Wrightson, John Totalben, that sort of lineage of proper ink and brush, and you could see the textures. And just one look at Mike's work, and even though Mike had largely done other projects before then, but you could tell that even from looking at your pages, you could tell that this brush just wants to do what it wants to do, and Mike wants to draw this character. And as soon as I saw those pages, I think we were discussing this yesterday. I tend to really write for the artists that I'm collaborating with. And it's really easy to write for Mike, especially really easy to write Swamp Things for Mike, because you can see that character is kind of ingrained in the influences that Mike carries.
Oh yeah.
The book feels really Vertigo-ish.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
From the first arc with the creature from the desert, you have this horror that sticks to your brain.
Yeah.
So obviously there's a lot of Alan Moore there, but I have to ask, what were your main directions? What did you want the project to go? Your inspirations?
Well, Ram had loads of. He was sending me really disturbing pictures. He's like, we really got to get into the body horror of all this.
It was for a good cause.
And so, yeah. I mean, you know most of the names of all these photos you were sending.
I kept. I don't know if you've seen it, but I had watched this show called Channel Zero. And to me, that was like really innovative contemporary horror done well. And that was some of the aesthetic that I wanted to bring to the book. I was very aware of the fact that it's going to be compared to Vertigo. It's going to be compared to Alan Moore because that's where my influences come from, clearly. So we have to make it stand out in terms of it being a modern contemporary book. So even though it does have the sort of that Vertigo DNA in it, it still feels like a contemporary comic. It doesn't feel like a comic that was made in the 80s. So yeah, I kept sending those references, lots of Cronenberg references as well.
There were so many body horror covers that got turned down.
Yeah. And there were a lot of covers that got turned down because they were too weird.
The book actually feels sometimes like an anatomy lesson, because you have these shots like the MRI he does for the brain and everything like that, where you don't use typical comic frame to help us penetrate through the psyche of what his transformation he's about to go through. So that comes from a true collaboration. Like, we would go backwards and forwards. Like Ram would write it and go, I think I've got a really good idea for how this should be laid out. And he'd send me little sketches and different things, and we'd incorporate it, or I'd say, I would say, I'm kind of seeing it more in this way. So it was a true collaboration, really. And those kind of, to work on a book like that, where it's a true collaboration, it's a real gift. Because usually you get the script and then you draw it, But to go backwards and forwards was wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like I said, I came into comics quite late, and so nobody told me what the rules were. So my brain's always like, what can I do that hasn't been done before?
Yeah.
I wonder if anyone's put an MRI into a comic.
Yeah.
And I distinctly remember that one because, in an MRI, when you get to the lower part of the brainstem, it looks like an apple.
Yeah.
It looks like the seeds when you slice through an apple. And so somewhere in my brain, there was a connection that, the brain connects to plants and seeds and apples and fruits.
Yeah. I mean, when we did those really anatomical ones, the future state stuff, I mean, I was drawing the brain, and I'm like, there's bits of broccoli in this.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I think that connection has always been there. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So it runs throughout the book, this idea that the body is also a plant and an organism and connected to the green in some way.
The future state one actually felt a bit pessimistic regarding humanity's future, which I'm sure is an obvious choice for something who is by itself an ecological creature. Then the rest of the series, the series itself deals with family, deals with trauma, deals with the Swamp Thing itself. But I think it's not as bleak and dark as we're gonna die because of climate change.
Yeah.
So is it something that you chose to do? It's not a critique. I love those issues, obviously, but it's just I think the direction changed quite a bit after that.
Right.
Well, so I'm gonna get a little bit philosophical here, but my one of my favorite quotes is actually someone asking Lars von Trier why he only directs really sort of bleak, depressing movies, and he goes like, because we don't learn anything from the good things that happen to us. And that's kind of true. It's kind of why the Greek tradition of tragedies lives on. I think we are impacted. We're naturally designed to be impacted by stories of not so nice things happening to us. And I do think that any system, any ecological system, or any system of philosophy or thinking has this kind of entropy that's part of it. So it's always in decay. So given a long enough period, every system will decay. And then out of that decay will come the beginning of the next system. So actually, I don't think that future state Swamp Thing is as bleak as you think it is, because in the end of the story, Swamp Thing sacrifices himself to save whatever remnants of humanity is left on the planet, because he says, no, because I am sure they will find a way to be better than what they are right now. So if anything, it's a really hopeful message packaged in a really depressing story. And I think that comes back to what I call sort of cynical optimism. Like, things are not going to go well because you see it, because you look at it around you and you go like, oh, people do terrible things sometimes, or people don't care about the planet sometimes. But then you have a choice. You can be pessimistic about it, or you can be optimistic. And being pessimistic about it doesn't accomplish anything. So you might as well be optimistic. Right. So I think the Swamp Thing series in itself is sort of infused with that kind of cynical optimism, in which, if you remember the end of the series, Levi says, I know you will come back. I know people will make mistakes. I know you have other plans, and I will be here every time. My job is to stop you, and I will stop you. So there isn't a question of I will win in the end, but no, just stopping you is the job, and I will be here and I will do it every time. So
even if I had a spade, I wouldn't be able to dig as deep as that.
Do you see where you would like to go if there is an opportunity for future plans there?
We would love to. We've still got plenty to say, I think.
Yeah. And to be honest, I think we introduced quite a few things that we might be able to take forward with the character like Trinity, with the Parliament of Gears, with introducing, bringing
fun to draw.
Yeah. And then bringing Tevi Holland back as well. So there are threads there that weren't necessarily tied off in the first series.
And there were a lot of new things in there as well, which you didn't really pursue.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you had that character that John McCrae introduced in. And she didn't really.
Sierra. Yeah. So there are lots of threads that we could pick on, and I think the more important question is, okay, what do we have to say next to the series? And I have some ideas about it, and I was talking to Mike, and obviously it's a conversation to be had with DC, and I know for a fact that they loved the book in the DC office, so I would be thrilled to come back to it at some point.
Yeah, because when we were following the publication of the book, it was first announced as
10 issues,
10 issues, and then it was prolonged, which is quite rare in the mainstream comic book industry. Yeah. And how did it affect also your writing, and how did it change maybe your story when you knew that you could tell more?
Actually, being the cocky bastard that I am, I pitched it that way to DC. I said, look, I'm going to pitch you 2 seasons. If season 1 doesn't do well, cancel the book. I'll walk away, no problem. But if it does well, give us a second season. And it did really, really well. And we got to the end of the first season, and I said, we want an extension. In fact, I remember at the time, I think a couple of editors had left DC, so they were a bit worried.
Yeah, we killed them all off. We worked through about 4 different editors, right?
Yeah, we did. This book, it eats editors. And so they were like, we don't know if we have someone to put on this book. But I was working at the time with Ben Mears, who was an assistant editor on Catwoman. And if you know Ben at all, you realize he's like a huge horror fan. He worked with Clive Barker before he was an editor here. So he was like, Swamp Thing, yes, I will absolutely edit that book. So I remember it was Ben and I emailing EIC, emailing Katie Kubert as well. They're like, hey, can I borrow Ben to edit this Swamp Thing book?
Right.
So we really kind of worked to make that season 2 happen. And I feel like there's a kind of bootstrap joy in making sure these things happen.
Right.
So this is gonna be the last question.
Yeah.
Hearing you talk about your relationship, obviously you connected, and it feels like it's working.
Yeah.
So Ram, you're also a creator-owned artist. Do you have maybe some plans to work again with Mike on something that
we've spoken.
Dun, dun, dun.
We've spoken about different things. Yes.
All right.
I mean, at the moment, I'm working on a project that actually comes out from DC next March. But we have spoken.
And I think this kind of relationship is really rare. And when you see that sort of openness in a collaborator, you should hang on for dear life and make as many cool things as you can. So
yeah, totally.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.